I chose that song. I'll come back to it in a little bit, but it's indicative of a sound of Delta blues and specifically what's known as the boogie woogie bass line. So gather round, children, while I give you the history of Robert Johnson.
Can I tell you how excited I am about this? Because I'm going to be learning something during this.
So this album, King of the Delta Blues Singers by Robert Johnson, was released in 1961. It's number 2 on the Best Ever Albums 1961 charts, 88 in the 60s, and 867 overall. This Robert Johnson album is only one of 2 albums really released that collected his material. Robert Johnson is basically the template for every blues album going forward after this point in the 30s, and is profoundly influential on a lot of the 60s rockers, and that's why we talk about him here. This is kind of a unique outlier probably on our journey. I don't think there's any other compilation albums or albums from artists that were alive earlier in the century that were then released in the 60s. This album's material was recorded in 1936 and 1937, and Robert Johnson is a man of myth and legend, basically because so little information about him exists. There's books still being written about him. One just came out in 2019, and because of the limited information, that's where the legend grows. And for example, they don't have a solid date of birth necessarily. They don't know where they don't actually know what his cause of death was. There's a lot of myth around that, and they don't actually even know where he's buried. Now, part of that, I think, is based on the fact that he was born and died in Mississippi in the 30s at the age of 27, and he was a black man in the South. I think that has to do with it also. A poor black man also. And
they weren't really keeping records of that type of demographic, were they?
Exactly. Yeah, they're not doing autopsies on poor black men in Mississippi to find out what happened to, especially a musician who, wandered around the South playing shows. So a little bit more about Robert Johnson. He was born on May 8th, 1911, at best guess, and he died August 16th, 1938 in Mississippi at the age of 27. His success came posthumously after his death, and his fame rose obviously in the 60s as well. This album, he was very much a progenitor. He typified the Delta blues sound, and that's what a lot of artists in the 60s were influenced by. Now, Delta blues is classified as also being known as the Mississippi blues. It's typically played acoustically with hollow-bodied guitars. The performers work solo. The guitar playing features finger picking, slide work, and boogie rhythms, and it's very emotional sounding. You can hear that in the clip that I had heard, and you can hear that throughout all of the songs on this album. Now, the album itself, Columbia Records released this album, and it was in 1961. It was the first compilation of his recordings ever. So, while technically a reissue, it served as an introduction to his music for so many musicians. These songs come from 2 recording sessions arranged by the American Record Company in makeshift hotel rooms, essentially, by an executive, Don Law, in 1936 in San Antonio and in 1937 in Dallas. Robert Johnson only recorded 29 songs total, and some of those have alternate takes to them. There's a really good complete collection of his recordings if you're interested in it, that has everything that he produced. But these 29 songs are who he was as a musician, and that's all we have. Now, why the interest in the 60s? Well, John Hammond, who worked for Columbia Records, was looking for Robert Johnson back in the 40s, I believe it said, and found out that he had died. He was trying to get together a bunch of artists for this show up in New York, and he went down there and found out that Robert Johnson had already passed away. And so he looked for Johnson in 1938, only to find out that he had died. And John Hammond was, we've mentioned him before in passing on some of our shows. He's also the person who signed Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan to Columbia. So he was a very, very important musician in the music industry, especially for Columbia.
And you said that he was 27 when he died?
Yeah, he was 27 when he died.
What's up with 27? Isn't that like Cobain and Hendrix and Joplin? Didn't they all die at 27 too? Jeez.
So the myths around Robert Johnson, the most famous one, in which I jokingly said at the beginning of the show, was that he sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads to learn to play the blues. And the myth about his death, and which is probably true, is that he was poisoned by a jealous husband. He was cheating on his wife, and there was complications with the poison. Apparently it wasn't supposed to actually kill him, but he succumbed to the poison, essentially.
How do you scientifically poison someone in a way to not kill them but debilitate someone in 1930s Mississippi? I'm sure that was a best laid plans.
I don't think they were. Yeah, they were definitely not doing it scientifically, but it was something mixed with whiskey, and he drank the whiskey, and instead of essentially like sweating the poison out, it may have exacerbated like an ulcer or something that he already had, and then he died that way. Jeez. Now, take this with a grain of salt too. That's the best guess because there's no cause of death on his death certificate. Like I said before, there was no autopsy done. There was a notation somewhere that I think through interviews with people or something that his cause of death may have been due to syphilis, but there's really no evidence to that. That was just noted on the end. So you can see how all these things kind of add to the myth that is him. When in reality, he was a man who was a working musician. He traveled around and playing juke joints in the South. He went as far as Detroit. He went to Nashville or Memphis. I think he even went to New York at one point. As far as the selling his soul to the devil thing, that had to do with the fact that he was a young kid and he wasn't a very good guitar player, and these fellow musicians didn't think he was very good. And then the next time they saw him, he was like a phenomenal guitar player. And when in reality, he had been traveling around and for 2 years up to that point when he came back and returned to those artists, other musicians. And it's now shown that he had learned from some other musicians as well. So, it's not like there's good record keeping back then. And there's no documentaries being made in the 30s about artists and interviews and things like that. So all of this stuff is cobbled together from people who knew him at that time. There were still alive, people that were interviewed in the 60s that were then old men or, older that were alive when Robert Johnson was alive in the 30s. If you are interested in this sort of thing, definitely check out. There's a couple music documentaries. There's a lot of books. But even these are all cobbled together from things, and there's pretty much like 3 or 4 authors or musicologists that have tackled this subject and are the experts on Robert Johnson. Another interesting thing that adds to the myth, there's only 2 known photographs of him. And so those are the photos that you see on any album that has a photo of him. Otherwise, it's interpretations like paintings of him at a scene or playing music or something like that.
Like the cover of this album.
Yeah, exactly, like the cover of this album. So what else? The influence. Let's get to that. So this album was released in the 60s and became influential to many musicians, especially UK musicians like the Rolling Stones. Eric Clapton was a huge influence on him. Led Zeppelin, Bob Dylan said he got some of his songwriting from influence from Robert Johnson. Also, this album sparked a renewed interest in the blues in general and in music and scholarship in Robert Johnson's life. It's not like today where everything is available and you can just Google search any artist song and get a whole track listing like what we do and see all the things that have been out. But, things, and this is true for, movies and everything too. For a long time, this stuff wasn't around. And if you didn't know about it, it would have been like unearthing gold to hear stuff that you had never heard before in this way. And the Delta Blues is raw in that respect, and it is emotional. Now I picked the song "Rambling on My Mind" because when you hear that song, you will know what the boogie woogie bass line and guitar sounds like. That is when Johnson used the bottom strings of the guitar to create the bass line. So he's essentially playing two guitar parts on one guitar. He's playing the rhythm section with the bottom strings of the guitar, and then he's playing the main parts on the other strings. And it's also known, he's also known for playing the slide guitar as well. His guitar playing was complex at this time. He was essentially imitating a piano with his guitar, playing those boogie woogie rhythms, while most musicians just played simple melodies. So the blues themselves, everyone thinks they know what the blues are. You have these themes of heartbreak, cheating spouses, religious themes in this album. My woman loves me, but or I love my woman, but she doesn't love me back. There's guns and ammunition songs in this album about 3220 Blues is about types of guns, like a rifle type of ammunition versus a 38 special, I think, and so all of the themes are there and contained in this album. Terraplane Blues is about a metaphor for sex and suspects another man may have been with her, the woman that he's with currently. And you can, as soon as you listen to that song, you can pick up on it. It's not subtle by any means. And so, yeah, that's kind of the history of him. There's, I hope I gave it justice to him. This is I found it to be a very important record. It's kind of, you listen to it, and then when you start reading about him, you get the power of his person and what he offered. So what did you guys think of this album? Matt, you want to start?
So, well, I would first say that, yeah, it's hard to research somebody that there's not much information on. So it's definitely a difficult task. I think I was a little surprised to see this on here because my first reaction was, well, it shouldn't be on this list, right? It was released in 1961, but it's a compilation album. And, it's not like he created this album and it was, this is a totally different sound than anything else that we're going to hear, in this list or any other list, because you're looking at something that was, 30 years prior to the time period that we're talking about. But I get it. I did know about Robert Johnson, before. Listening to this record made me think back to when I was in college and I took a history of jazz class. and the teacher gave out it's kind of like, yeah, you're learning about the history of popular music and stuff, and jazz and stuff, and the blues and stuff that came before it. And so there was a Robert Johnson, actually the version of Hellhound on My Trail, which is towards the end of this album, was on that mix that the professor made. But I felt like this was listening. This is, to me, John, you've used this term before, but this is the definition of me doing my homework. Taking my medicine. I'm sorry, as you put it. Because this is not an easy listen. I feel like you hear one song and you've heard them all, at least sonically and musically. It seems like he enters every song with the same guitar lick, like and it just goes right into the blues. But I will say that I was particularly impressed. He's playing the blues as they totally, as they came out later on with bands like Cream and guys like Clapton and and Page and everybody that just Hendrix and the blues, which is just the foundation of all rock and roll. Really, it's what the Stones basically were. But he's doing it all on an acoustic guitar, which is, it's really hard to do that, to really make like a blues sound come through crisp or come through in a way that's really meaningful. I think a lot of B.B. King, a lot of these other blues artists, they're all using electric guitars, which are easier to play. If you ever play an electric guitar versus an acoustic guitar, it's an electric guitar is light years easier to play because there's a lot more room for error. So if you make a mistake, or if you don't push down a string hard enough, you can, the other strings, the distortion, whatever you got going on with the amplifier can muffle that. It's really hard to do that with an acoustic guitar. You got to be pretty much technically proficient. And he's doing it, man. He's hitting it. He's making you feel it. He's bending the strings, and you're feeling his pain. So I certainly give him credit for that. But overall, for me, this was a tough listen. It's 40 some odd minutes long, I think, and it's one thing after another that sonically is kind of the same thing. So I can't imagine I would go back to this. I did find that there was a song on here that sounded like, I think it's the third song, Come On in My Kitchen. It sounds just like the Stones' You Gotta Move, which on Sticky Fingers. So it's got the same, it's almost like and I think You Gotta Move was actually a cover that the Stones did, but that...
No, they covered a different song for Let It Bleed.
Well, You Gotta Move was on Sticky Fingers, though. And
yeah, so I'd just say they covered a Robert Johnson song on Let It Bleed. Okay. They just gave it a nom de plume to avoid legal issues, yeah.
Oh, gotcha. Well, this sounds, But I mean, it's hard. I mean, you're playing the blues. It's pretty much the same thing, right? You're just doing it in slightly different ways. But it was a cool listen. I'm glad I did it, but I can't say I'm going back to this. It's not the production level is not there. I'm just too used to modern music, and it's hard to go back to for me. But it was cool to kind of revisit a little bit or learn a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I get that totally. So what about you, John?
So for me, coming into the albums in the 60s, I will be the first to admit that when we get to jazz, I'm going to be taking that as sort of a neophyte, just a novice listener, because my jazz background is not as refined. So it's going to be sort of, how do I feel? What am I learning? With blues, I have a little bit more background, but there is a world of time between the B.B. King style blues that would come before the artist that Matt talked about as the predecessors to the playing that you would hear in the 50s and 60s, and what Robert Johnson represents, which is sort of the ground level blues. I'm talking just one person playing a guitar, as Matt said, an acoustic guitar, playing it in two different ways each song, which, I just heard you talk about how he sort of played one as almost a bass and the other as a rhythm, and then he had a slide as well that he could play. And you can see that because he does small things with his picking that are complicated, even at that stage. And he also does some things where he'll just hang on to one note and just pluck one note for a minute, for a long time. And it's not an easy thing to do, to get something out of one note in your bare voice. So I appreciate how this led to that B.B. King, Muddy Waters style blues that I do like quite a bit. As Matt said, it's the recording it sounds like it's a lost recording from the 1930s. It certainly isn't in any way crisp or polished. if you've heard one song, to some degree, you've heard all of them, because with the acoustic guitar, I think there's only so much you can do. In the same way that the electric is easier to play, I think it's in some ways versatile in terms of tone, but also when blues musicians were coming later, they were playing with more pieces of the band, which led to more sonic texture. But I could appreciate it. It depends on if we're talking about Robert Johnson, fascinating historical figure, or if we're talking about Robert Johnson, musician. And I don't have heroes, and so when you read about Robert Johnson a lot, I think he represented the equivalent of a hero for a lot of people, especially in the 60s. In terms of white artists who sort of want to feel that they're getting to the roots of the music they're playing. And for black blues players, I think he represented a much more tangible, direct connection from era 1 of blues to era 2, which then led into era 3, which became sort of the 60s and 70s blues, or the derivative rock from it. So when you're listening to it and you hear blues, I think it's important that you know the blues you're listening to here isn't just the blues that you might be thinking of, which is more like a 50s, 60s blues sound. This is a even more stripped down, almost spiritual style song construction. And that's what it sounds like to me. It's spirituals. It's also incredibly direct in its lyricism. And that's why it's funny to me that Dylan said his songwriting was influenced by it. So he might think that, but Dylan wrote, as a chimera the entire time. Like almost nothing is direct. Whereas Robert Johnson, I mean, you said sings the blues and sings about hardships. He sings about those, but the number one thing he sings about the most is sex. And it's sex overtly. And violence. Sex and violence come up in, I would say, 16 of the songs on this album, and it makes sense because the Mississippi Delta blues sound, it has that dark tenor, and in that era, sex was forbidden, and violence was the outgrowth to some degree. It was around you at all times, I'm sure, as a black man in Mississippi in the 30s or his formative years in the 20s, and so that is really the crux of the songwriting. So it would be interesting to see what people in the 60s who were not African American, I think they were pulling almost like a narrative that allowed them to go back to another era, a feel for it. But it's I would imagine it would have been a much more visceral feel for the blues musicians who heard him in the next generation who were African American.
I wondered researching how much revisionist history or how much weight they put to attribute to him.
He's got a little James Dean to him, you know what I mean? Where he died early, and I think I did a little bit of research. They compared him to James Dean. They say he had very little output, but that output was outsized in influence because everybody loves sort of a little bit of a mystery. And I think Robert Johnson,
And thank God this guy existed, I mean, thank God for this album. It's just if you want to look at rock and roll in terms of the timeline of a life, I mean, this music is basically, it's rock and roll in its infancy. I'm not even sure the baby got out of the nursery, when this album, this is the groundwork for everything that we're listening to today in a lot of ways, popular music anyway. And it's just, and it's cool that it's out there, and it's cool that so many artists were able to get a hold of this. And I see why it's an important album in 1961. Normally I say, well, if you're going to make a compilation, to me, compilations and live albums shouldn't make these lists because, hell, I'll make you a mix of music from the 60s and it'll be number 1 on the list. That doesn't make it a top album. But I think you can get a little bit of leeway here because it did come out in that time. It was something that nobody had ever heard of before because they didn't have the ability to do so.
Well, if you only wrote, 24 songs, Josh? I mean, that's 29. So that's basically 2 albums, right? If we think about it. So it really does represent, okay, if we're going to make an album, this is what it is. So in fairness to him, it's less of a compilation if you're picking, between 29 songs than 100. I do think one of the funny things is, people love to trip over themselves to seem as sophisticated as possible. And I'm not saying that's what happened with this, but for Eric Clapton to say that this was more of an influence on him than the next generation, I mean, it's hard to see him listening to Robert Johnson and saying, this is what I'm going to become, as opposed to like Muddy Waters or BB. You know what I'm saying? It's just, there's a direct line, and I don't doubt that they were sincere and they did listen to his work, but it does reek a little bit to me of like, what gives me more credibility? You know what I mean? To say this, this somewhat unknown blues musician who was making complicated stuff is my direct influence, as opposed to someone who still is writing and performing. And
I'd venture to say that. Go ahead.
Yeah,
sorry.
I was going to say I'd argue to say that even people like Little Richard and stuff are much more in line with some of what these blues-based, especially white musicians in the 60s sounded like, as opposed to Robert. To me, it's impossible to uncouple Robert Johnson's lyrics with what coming of age and being young, because he was young at all points, in Mississippi for a black man would be. And to me, that comes through even more so than maybe the sound of his music itself,
Yeah, I would even venture to say that someone like Jack White would probably say that same thing about him, that he was a huge influence on him. So I get that, but at the same time, it's, you could do a direct line. I mean, you talk about direct lines. I mean, this is where it started, right? This is where How Muddy Waters and B.B. King and, Bo Diddley. And I mean, this is just the genesis of rock and roll, so it's got to get paid its due. But like I said, it's a tough listen. It's not, there are many, many other things I would go to before this, and a lot of other things in the blues. I think the blues are better when you have the electric guitar, you have the bass, you've got the band, and you got the you just got the production behind it, and it's a much more enjoyable listen. But yeah, it's still cool to kind of go back and revisit this, because this is more of a historical venture than like a musical one for me, at least. So
yeah, the final takeaway is like what you both have said, is that it's foundational to all the modern rock that we listen to,
and country. I'd like to point out, because there's a pretty direct line between country and country western, and then outlaw country and stuff, and this type of music as well. And so I do want to say that there's a little bit more concentric circles in terms of that genre of music as well, and this type of music.
Yep. Yeah. So Robert Johnson, alive forever.
I'd recommend it for people that really want to do that deep dive in the homework, but for the average person, I think you can probably pass and just listen to a little bit more modern stuff.
If you're looking for recommendations to put on in your car or add to your playlist, I don't know if this fits it, but if you're a completist and you enjoy listening to us riff on history for a while, digging back into this one is a good use of your time. But if you're more listening to just find enjoyable music, I wouldn't say it's not enjoyable, but it's not going to be a light listen.
Or just listen to the first 2 or 3 tracks and then move on, because it's not going to vary much at all for the rest of the 15 tracks or so.
Yeah, gotcha. But if anybody is listening and would like us to add some context, or feels we gave it short shrift, I do view blues in the same category as jazz for me. That I look at them as things I'm going to learn more about and make connections with as we do these albums, which actually I'm pretty excited about, because I don't know if I would have done that without this project.
Yep, agreed.